Hi, this is John Howell, and we are going to be talking today about Uber and Lyft and some of the issues they may have involving criminal issues or civil issues. And joining me is Silva Megerditchian, who is an awesome criminal defense attorney. She was a former public defender with the city of Los Angeles. And anyone who knows the city of Los Angeles and being a public defender there knows that they've seen a lot of cases, all types of cases, basically any type of criminal case you can see. She's seen it. And I'm John Howell, so I do personal injury cases, and I've handled cases involving Uber and Lyft drivers, car crashes, or other types of cases that they may have. And I asked Silva to join me today so we could talk a little bit about specifically some of the criminal issues that might come up. And one thing that we see a lot with Uber and Lyft drivers is they have those recording like cameras in their cars because they want to make sure that the passengers are behaved. They also want to make sure that if they're in an accident that there's a recording of it. I was wondering if a police officer pulls them over, is there an issue with the Uber or Lyft driver recording their interaction with the police officer?
Hi, John. Thanks so much for having me. And no, not really, because usually these cameras are mounted on the car, and an officer does have the right to ask you to stop recording if they feel that you're interfering in an investigation. But usually what happens is these recordings are absolutely essential. They help the officer gather more evidence. They will usually ask the Uber driver for a copy of the video. So it's usually very effective, and we really do love when a camera is involved, especially if my client's innocent.
How about, so we talked about the cameras that are already there, and I've seen
Yeah,
some videos on social media where people will take their phone out and then start
yeah.
recording. Is that the same thing? Like you're allowed to do it unless it's interfering with the investigation?
Look, usually officers don't want a camera stuck in their face. They can always interpret that as a threat. And I always tell my clients, when there's an officer involved, be very careful about what you do because a camera can be misconstrued as a weapon. An officer who's had a stressful day will easily over anticipate what you're doing. So you want to have your hands totally visible. You can always ask, officer, I would feel more comfortable if you were taping this on your body cam, and then the officer can tell you, well, don't worry, it's getting filmed. That helps. But I always tell clients your number one goal is safety. Just be careful about what you do because the last thing you want is an officer shooting you if they think that they're being threatened.
Absolutely. And you mentioned body cam, and that made me think if you're pulled over, let's say you're an Uber or Lyft driver, you're pulled over and you want to get that body cam footage. Are you aware of like how the best way to get that?
Well, in a criminal case, you have the right to see that footage once you have an attorney representing you. And if you're the victim, the district attorney will likely give you a copy as well, just so you can see it, too. But John, how does like a personal injury attorney, does the court allow you guys to use the body camera in court? I know for us it's essential, but what about a PI case where let's say the Uber driver and the person that hits them, right? How do they prove liability and acceptability of that footage?
So that's a good question. Usually, in other cases, I've been able to get it through a public records request
Okay.
if like the investigation is done. So I know like if there's a criminal investigation still going or they're still going to do if there's a criminal case involved, sometimes they don't want to give me the body cam footage unless I subpoena it later in the
Right.
case using a civil subpoena. But I've had cases where it's just a like a car crash and it can be like you were describing, it can be very helpful because the police officer's interviewing a witness or the other party, and you know how they write in the statement, they'll write a summary, but
Yeah.
sometimes that it's a summary and it's not verbatim what the person says, and you can learn a lot even through their mannerisms watching that camera.
John, what about insurance companies? I deal with so many clients that are so afraid of fraud claims, like maybe their rendition of the story is different what the camera states. Does the insurance company get a copy of that camera footage?
Yeah, so before the case is filed, the insurance company could also do a public records request and get a
Okay.
copy of it. after the case is filed, I'm thinking of one case in particular where a individual was in a triathlon and a sheriff had waved a vehicle because they were protecting traffic for the triathlon, but waved a vehicle in front of my client who was racing. And
Yeah.
so the sheriff had the camera and then did some interviews. We got that. It took some time, but we got it through a civil subpoena. And the insurance company, by that time, they had attorneys and they reviewed it. And it became very helpful because it had statements. And in terms of admissibility at trial, it's probably similar to a criminal case. Usually you have the police officer lay the foundation. So you have them talk
Yes.
about that they have it. I was thinking you might even be able to, no, I think that you might be able to do it without the police officer if there was a custodian of records. But I think
Yeah.
the perfect sense would be to have that police officer say, yes, I was wearing this camera and I turn it on and it records accurately and all of that.
And I'll tell you also for criminal cases, there's nothing more important than that body cam. And 9 times out of 10, it's going to be admissible. I always advise my clients too, if you know you are in the wrong, whether it be an accident or it be, anything where violence is included, and you know you're in the wrong, don't say anything, because the worst thing you could do is you're on camera and all of a sudden what you say is different than what was seen on the camera, and automatically your credibility in front of a jury is completely gone. So a lot of people will ask me, if I know I'm in the wrong and the officers are asking me questions, what do I say? I always tell them, look, I can't influence testimony, but if it happens in the future, just say, officer, I don't feel comfortable talking right now without my attorney present. Can you call me at a later time, or we can set up an interview and I'll come with my attorney? You absolutely have the right to remain silent. And what's interesting, John, is how many of my clients in nervousness, they will say so much, hire me after, and I can't cure the statement. Does that happen with you guys too in the personal injury realm?
Absolutely. They'll tell the police officer something and then it'll end up in a report. And it makes it sometimes makes it very difficult or impossible for me to help them. And that makes me think right just a little bit right now what you're talking about. Let's take the specific scenario where you're an Uber or Lyft driver and you've got a passenger in the back seat and you start seeing the lights and the sirens. Police officer comes up to your window. Is there anything you recommend they say specifically in that instance?
To the Uber driver
Yeah.
themselves?
Yeah, what should they say once you've got the police officer walking up and they're knocking on their window?
I mean, I think the biggest thing is understanding your culpability. For instance, is the Uber driver drinking? If that's the case, never admit to alcohol consumption. Try as much as you can to stay controlled, regardless of what it is. Now, it flips. Let's say the Uber driver had called the police, there was some kind of an assault. I always say it's imperative it's almost like a race. Who gets the finish line first? Sometimes the person who makes the initial police report is the one who's believed. So it depends. If it's a DUI in some kind of criminal action, never admit to the fault. If it's a personal injury situation or someone is beaten and you are the victim, you got to call the police first, because it
Right.
almost like holds your place in line, you
Right.
know?
Right.
And as you know, everything you say can and will be used against you.
Absolutely.
It's such a stressful situation. And then also in those assaults, right? Sometimes you're the victim, and all of a sudden the person that assaults you flips the script and tells the cop they're the victim, and the cop has to make a determination of credibility. And usually they're going to go for the person that made that initial report. So
Right.
it's incredible. What do you recommend, John, when there's an accident and officers are called? What do you tell your clients? Like, what makes it a winner case for you when there's that kind of police activity?
Yeah, if there's an accident, I definitely recommend calling the police. And if you're sure that you're not at fault, making sure that you clearly, simply tell the story factually what happened and give as little unnecessary detail as possible. So if it was a rear end accident, just simply saying, I was stopped for traffic and I felt an impact to the rear. You don't have to go into
Okay.
detail like, oh, I just picked up this passenger and they were talking to me a lot. And then I got a text message, but that has nothing to do with it, because the police officer will write all that stuff down. And even though you're clearly not at fault, someone will go through that statement and look for reasons why they can hold you at fault. If you were at fault or maybe you're not sure, then again, I would say as little as possible and don't make any unnecessary admissions. So if maybe you think you were at fault because you made a left turn, you just say, I was making a left turn and I crashed into the person. You don't have to say also, I think I was at fault, or I'm sorry, I didn't know what happened, it was my fault, because they will write that admission, and there could be a reason why you weren't at fault. Even in the situations, like for example the left turn one, the other vehicle could have been speeding, or they should have yielded because you were already turning, things like that.
Right, right. Is there I have a lot of clients that are so nervous after an accident. Is it okay to say, officer, and I'm in shock. Right now is not the best time to talk to me. Can we just wait a few minutes or call me later? In a criminal action, we do that all the time because I don't want my client to incriminate themselves. Can you use that in a personal injury claim?
Absolutely. You can let
Okay,
them know you're not ready to talk. Some people are so severely injured they're in the hospital, can't talk. So
right.
that happens a lot. But it is important to follow up and speak to the officer, so there is your statement in the report.
And when's the best time to contact you? I tell clients, as soon as you're safe, you absolutely call me. And sometimes even the officers will have me on speakerphone. It doesn't happen frequently, but I actually did have my client call. And the officer actually said, um, Miss Silva, because no one can say my last name, maybe we can set up an appointment with your client to come talk. And that was an incredible opportunity. It usually doesn't happen. But again, some officers, again, they're just like us. They're people that have families. They want to wrap up their investigation. And sometimes they're extremely polite. What do you recommend? When is the best time to call a PI attorney after an accident of this nature with an Uber driver?
I recommend calling as soon as you're able. Same thing what you're saying, as soon as you're safe, because getting an attorney involved early on the civil like accident side, they can start doing an investigation early on, collecting evidence, speaking to witnesses, because as you know, the more time that goes by, people's
Yeah,
memory
yeah.
fades, evidence disappears. And you just made me think about something. Let's say in the scenario where the police officer pulls over the Uber or Lyft driver, maybe suspects that they're high or they've been
Yeah.
drinking, and starts asking them to do a field sobriety test. I mean, can the driver at that point call you, just get you on the phone and say, "Hey, they're asking me to do a field sobriety test"?
No, look, what usually happens in a DUI investigation and what people have to realize is the field sobriety tests are voluntary. And so is the preliminary alcohol screening test. That's a test that you take at the scene. What is not voluntary and what can suspend your license for a year is refusing the breath test at the station. It's called the chemical test. It can be a blood test, it could be a urine test, and it's a chemical test. That one, if you say no to, that's going to be bothersome because, again, that will suspend your license for a year. If you know at the scene that you might not be under the legal limit, I tell my clients for future reference, you can waive the field sobriety test and you can waive the preliminary alcohol screening test because the more time that goes forward, the more likely your blood alcohol content will go down. And I've had the gamut. I've had clients who, again, it's really difficult. Depends how drunk the client is, depends how high they are from the point of weight. So you just have to be smart and know your body. And I tell everybody, avoid it, right? Just take an Uber or a Lyft. Don't drive with alcohol in your system. And for an Uber or Lyft driver who is pulled over with alcohol, again, you're looking at a suspension, your insurance rates going up, and Uber and Lyft not rehiring you.
Right.
So just avoid it and call Uber and Lyft.
How about if the police officer pulls you over and they want you to to open your trunk. They want to look inside, or they want to inspect your vehicles, things that are not just something you can see out through the window. Do you have any
Right.
recommendations?
I do. And here's the biggest thing I want everyone to know is that when it comes to searches, if the officer asks to search your vehicle, you have the right to say no. I had this discussion with a client the other day where he had something he shouldn't have had. He was pulled over for something so simple, and it was speeding. And the officer had a funny feeling that something else was wrong. And he said, "Sir, may I search your vehicle?" And my client goes, "Oh, yeah, I have nothing to hide." Trust me, he had something to hide because he was arrested for possession of it. So the key is don't make their jobs easy. You can be polite and humble and courteous. Please be polite, humble, and courteous because, again, you don't want a cop to get the wrong idea about you because then your night never ends with the officer. And say, "Officer, I'm so sorry. I really don't consent to this search. Do you think something's wrong? I mean, I really don't want to consent to this search." Be humble and courteous, but you don't have to consent. As a defense attorney, we have no argument if you consent to a search and they find something because consent is an exception that the courts allow. And again, if the officer's wearing body camera and you say yes to a search, there it is.
And
Whatever
a
they
lot of
get,
Yeah,
yeah,
and a lot of people probably feel like they want to be helpful, and if the
yes,
officers and they maybe feel like they can't say no to the officer, but
right.
what you're saying is that if they're asking you, can I search your pockets or can I search your trunk? That's a search, and you have the right to say no.
Yes. John, what's your biggest piece of advice for an Uber driver who's a victim of an accident or someone who's in the Uber car, a passenger, where the Uber driver is reckless and a massive accident happens? What is the right of that passenger?
For the passenger, if the Uber driver is being reckless,
Yes, and they're getting to an accident. Can the passenger sue does the passenger sue the driver? Does the passenger sue Uber? What is their rights as a passenger?
it's a good question. So typically, if the Uber driver or Lyft driver was negligent while operating the car, we would sue both the driver and Uber or Lyft because they're
Okay.
responsible because they were working together. And what I've also seen is where, and we've talked a little bit about this before, where maybe a passenger assaults a driver. Maybe it's not just a car accident, but it's something that happens within the car. And
Okay.
we've seen these articles where sometimes an Uber Lyft driver is accused of assaulting a passenger. Sometimes
Yeah.
the passenger is the one that's doing the assault. Do you have any recommendations if an Uber or Lyft driver is being accused of assaulting a passenger?
Well, I tell all my Uber and Lyft clients because this happens so much. A lot of times they'll claim self-defense. It is absolutely essential that if it is allowed, they should have some kind of recording device in that car. Not only does it protect them from being a victim of crime, but it also protects them from, future liability. Unfortunately, as you know, John, it's such a litigious time where everybody is trying to get a dollar from everybody. You just want to be careful and just make sure that you're protected. You have the right to use reasonable self-defense. And what that means is if you believe someone's going to hurt you, you may defend yourself in a reasonable fashion. So make sure you have a camera, make sure you make an immediate police report, and make sure you're safe no matter what. And then, John, can an Uber driver sue a passenger if they were assaulted by them? And can they sue Uber too for not protecting them?
That's a good question. So an Uber driver that's assaulted by a passenger can sue the passenger, but there's a couple things that you should be aware of. First is that the person that you're suing might not have any money to pay for
Right.
it. So you have to think about, am I going to be able to recover? Sometimes, if there's a dispute about whether it was intentional or not, I've seen cases where a person's homeowner policy or rental policy will kick in and they'll
Right.
help pay, which is ideally in a lot of these cases, you want some sort of insurance because insurance will pay versus going after someone personally. they could take a long time, they could go bankrupt. I've also had situations where there was a criminal civil case crossover, and we've been able to collect money through restitution. But in restitution, as you know, you're limited on what you can recover. It's usually
Yes.
medical bills, lost wages. You can't recover pain and suffering, which can often be worth, if what you go through, the harm and the loss that you've sustained could be quite a bit.
Yeah.
I was going to ask you a question about, Uber and Lyft drivers, sometimes they could be undocumented immigrants, and they could be concerned. Do you have any recommendations, or have you ever heard of situations where the police officer is calling ICE after pulling someone over for a speeding ticket?
Okay, so this is really important, and again, it's something that affects so many of my clients. I do have a lot of undocumented clients, and again, in California, they do have valid California driver's license. This advice only applies to California, and namely Los Angeles County. In LA County, sheriffs and LAPD do not ask about immigration status. They do not. Now, if you are arrested and you are undocumented, you absolutely 100% should hire an attorney. That attorney will consult with an immigration attorney to make sure whatever you're charged with does not have an adverse effect on your immigration. Because there is a difference between local authorities arresting you and the federal government through INS getting involved. You don't want to mess around with that. And if you have hopes of becoming a resident, getting a green card, or becoming a full citizen, you want to make sure that whatever you are stopped for, you can get off your record. You can seal it or expunge it or do what you have to do so you can be a citizen of this country. I will tell you, a lot of people are in the process of getting their citizenship when some crazy arrest happens. And by the time we settle the case, what they want most in life, to be a citizen of this country, is delayed. So the number one advice I give people, no matter what, immediately call a criminal defense attorney. Make sure you tell them your status, because everything you say to us is attorney-client privilege. We don't disclose it to anybody. Allow the criminal defense attorney to contact an immigration attorney to make sure no matter what and how you go forward, it won't stay on your record and affect the process of you becoming a citizen. But I will tell you, the jails in LA County have stopped deporting from the officers calling INS. So you don't have to worry about that aspect, but you do have to worry about them getting involved when you're becoming a citizen. So I tell everybody, you don't have to disclose your status. Just make sure you disclose your status to your attorney so they can help you.
Got it. And what if the police officer pulling over an Uber or Lyft driver, and that driver has maybe a warrant out for their arrest, or they have an unpaid speeding ticket, something like that?
Yes. So traffic tickets, usually you will not be arrested for that warrant. The warrant that you're going to be arrested for is something within like a $20,000 or above range. If you missed a court date, you will be arrested. If you didn't finish something on your probation for a misdemeanor, they can take you in. So I always say, for everybody that has a warrant, if the officer cites you and says, "Hey, buddy, you have a warrant, you really should fix this," immediately the following day, if it's a work day, go to the court where that warrant comes from and clear it. It's absolutely essential. If you go involuntarily, 9 times out of 10, the judge will appreciate that.
And if there is a warrant for arrest, that level that you were talking about, when you get pulled, let's say you just get pulled over for running a stop sign, are you going to get arrested at that time?
No, usually for traffic tickets, no. Even for unpaid parking tickets these days, the courts have come down and said, there's no reason to actually put the person in jail for that kind of thing. However, you're going to be cited to court. And if you don't go, that's going to be a problem. So if you have a warrant for a speeding ticket, you're given a ticket from the officer to go to court, and you miss that court date, yeah, that's going to be a much higher warrant. And then you have the risk of being arrested. Trust me, I've been in this business for over 17 years. If anything like that happens, take care of it. Don't say tomorrow, tomorrow, tomorrow. It's far worse to let it slide than just handle it up front.
Right. Well, thanks, Silva, for talking to me about all these issues that come up for Uber and Lyft drivers, and hopefully we'll talk again.
Yeah, and thank you, John, because even as a driver for me, there's nothing more nerve-wracking than getting involved in an accident. And thankfully, I always have you in my back pocket to call because even though I know not to say anything and not to do anything, once those nerves get involved, you really want someone on your side to guide you through. So,
And same
yeah,
thing with the criminal process.
yeah. All
Well,
right, John,
thanks.
till next time, my friend.
Till next time.